gardening in different parts of the province or different parts of the country will vary quite a bit because of the differences in climate and that kind of stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I want to do some of these series. It's just to take a look at how our climate here in Kent County, in this part of the province, is affected by the Northumberland Strait. You know, there's certain air currents. There's a lot of wind here. We're coastal. So all of these things have a big impact on how the garden grows and what kind of forces we're up against when we're trying to get our perfect tomatoes and our big juicy melons and tall proud corn, right? So we'll be looking at some of these things, how our day length time changes over the course of the year, and how we can use that to our advantage to grow foods in ways that other parts of the world might not be able to. We're here on the on right on the east coast of the province. Ocean currents, they bring us some very special climate activities or climate characteristics that are a little bit different than from different parts of the province. For instance, in the St. John River Valley, you've got a much warmer climate. They're a climate zone ahead of us. We're a little bit colder here. Here in Kent County, we're in 5B. And so that gives us a very nice growing climate. You know, we got a beautiful sunny weather for the most part. Usually, typically, in this part of the province, we get typically 3 days of sun, 1 day of rain. 3 days of sun, 1 day of rain in the summertime. But that's been fluctuating an awful lot lately. So we need to take some precautions into to make sure that things are going okay. One of the big precautions that we need to make sure is when we build trellises, because especially those of us who are right on the coast, the winds can be horrendous. So if you build a trellis to grow your tomatoes or your cucumbers or your peas, if you want to set up a trellis for growing peas, you really need to make sure that it's solid, very, very strong, robust. Because once it's covered in plants, it becomes a big old sail. And when the wind hits that, boys, oh boys, sometimes it can bring everything down. I've had that happen to me a couple of times. I had this little tripod, like a little teepee set up there with strings going all around there, and the wind blew it over, tipped it over, and uprooted all of my cucumbers mid-season. So I didn't have any cucumbers at all that season. It's very, very sad. So I learned two things there. One, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Plant cucumbers or plant things in a couple of different spots in your garden if you have the room. Two, build strong. Build for the absolute worst winds that you can think of, because when the wind comes in here, beautiful sunny day, doesn't prepare you for what kind of storms we get hit with around here. So that's two things that we need to take into consideration. Our solstices, because of our how far north we're at, our summer solstice and our winter solstices give us a very, very big differences in our day length time. So we're just coming out of December, January, February, right? We're in the cold and the dark months of the year. So right now, well, I should say in December, on the winter solstice, the sun would rise at 8 o'clock, 8:08 in the morning, and the sun would go down at 5:49 p.m., giving us only 8 hours and three-quarter, not quite 9 hours of sunlight per day. But in summertime, we get almost 16 hours of sunlight. But that's on the first day of summer. After the first day of summer, every summer day is shorter and shorter. So we're getting less sun during most of what we consider our growing season. So that's why it's so important. If we can get a jump start on our gardening season with some frost protection, And with plants that can handle a little bit of cold in the early spring, we can really get a jump start on our season because that day length is, the springtime leading up to the first day or the 21st of June gives us immensely long growing period for the plants. So it's like plants like our lettuces and our spinach, our peas, our onions. These are all things that we can plant way ahead of time and get a lot of productivity while other plants like our cucumbers and our tomatoes are still hiding away inside waiting for nice weather to come out. But onions in particular are very, very resistant to frost, even freezing solid. An onion
Hmm.
can survive. And one of the important parts about onions, like a lot of folks have trouble getting big onions. Most of us grow onions from sets, little bulbs of onions that are basically dormant. And we'll start our garden in June. We wait until last frost. And by the way, last frost here in our part of the province is May 24th, but it's never May 24th.
Hmm.
That's just kind of like a guide. There's a period of about 2 weeks following May 24th where frost can happen like anytime at all. So, take precautions when you put your plants out. If you put them out a little early, give them a couple of frost blankets on top so that they can, they can survive the worst of the cold nights every now and then, especially during a full moon. We tend to have a colder nights during the full moon. I'm not sure why, but that's one of the characteristics that we notice here is that the full moon gives us a cold night, and if that coincides in the middle of that 2 week period following May 24th, that can give us a frost very easily. And I've seen frost, I've experienced frosts in mid June, late June, even at times. It happens. The weather here in New Brunswick and on the East Coast here in particular is highly unpredictable, chaotic, and you can't predict. So, it's a matter of just taking your precautions, have a little insurance policy. That's where frost blankets really come into play. So you'll notice here the length of the shadow on that tree during the summer solstice. The shadow is very short, but as the season goes on further, the shadows get much longer. Now this has an impact on where you place things in your garden. Something that might not be in the shade at the beginning of the season by the fall might end up being covered by shade and have less sun, much less sun by the end of the season than you would have normally. So you want to take shade into consideration when you're planting, for instance, lettuce. You can plant lettuce early in the season in, very, very early spring and get a head start. But as soon as it gets warm, those lettuces are going to bolt. They'll turn sour, and they're not so good anymore. So by August, you typically don't have your spring lettuces are pretty much well done. But if you have a tall plant, say you have a row of corn, a couple of rows of corn, or some tomatoes that are very leafy, on the north side of these tall plants in midsummer, or even late summer, you can plant a second crop of lettuces and spinach and all of these other things, but on the north side of these tall plants so that they're in the shade and they don't get that really, really intense afternoon heat. The hottest part of the day is between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. See where your shadows are during that time of day, and that's where you'd want to plant your second crop or your second planting of lettuce for your fall crop. And you can that can keep you into lettuce well into full solid frost in October or November. Um, there's a lot of plants as well that are not like gardening doesn't start in June and end in September. There's a lot of plants that you can start in April, or early May. You know, there's other plants that can go on until November or even December. I've often harvested my carrots in December. And after a couple of frosts, things like carrots and broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and all of these other things, a light frost sweetens them. And I mean, obviously that doesn't happen for tomatoes, but for these crops like the kale crops and carrots, a lot of root vegetables, they when the frost hits them, they'll increase the sugar content in their tissues in order to survive that frost. So that gives you a much sweeter flavor. If you want to get a kid hooked on gardening and you want them to eat their vegetables, give them a carrot after a light frost, and they'll be hooked forever. Personal experience. I've done this. Um, so like I said, let's take advantage of that very long spring day. On the lead up in May and April, May and June. There, you got some really long days that can benefit a great deal your overall productivity for the year. Now these sessions, we're going to have a session every 2 weeks throughout the spring. So you'll notice, like right now, it's dark. If you check these sessions, we're going to be recording these sessions and you can review them later on, but you'll notice that there's going to be a time when the sun is going to be up until the end of our session. Right now, we start our sessions, it's dark, but the sunset comes in later and later every day. And by the end of these sessions, we'll probably still have some daylight when we're ready to sit down and have our and have these sessions. Just to show, like, these are some of the things that we typically don't notice, especially in a modern era. We're kind of on our clocks and on our TVs and our computers, and we don't necessarily notice a lot of these things. These are, we in the old days when people lived by candlelight, they knew very clearly, the day length would change and all that stuff. It had a big important part of their lives. Now we have electrical light, so we don't necessarily feel that in our daily lives so much. But when it comes to gardening, we really need to align to the natural cycles, to the seasons, and to the ebbs and flows of the way nature likes to do things. And if we align to that, and we are respectful of the way nature, the seasons flow, we can really get uh, in simpatico. We can work in tangent with Mother Nature and grow a lot more food. So February is a time of year that I like to start my onions. Now, a lot of folks have trouble growing big onions. Like I said before, they grow with sets, and they'll plant them in June. But an onion is daylight sensitive. So when the day length starts to shorten, so basically on the first day of summer, that triggers the onion to create its bulb. So if we only planted our onion sets um in the beginning of June, they've only got, like, say June 1st. If we plant our onions on June 1st, they've only got 21 days to grow all of their leaves before they start to bulb. And they don't have a lot of time to do that. With onions, every leaf on your onion represents one ring inside your onion. So the more leaves you have, the more potential your onion has to get larger. So we have a race to grow as many leaves as possible before June 21st. If we can do that, then we'll have those kinds of onions that are going to make all of your gardening friends who haven't heard about this, make them green with envy. And of course, that's one of the great goals of gardeners, right? Is to make your gardening friends envious of the bounty growing into your garden. So we're giving you a hint here on how to get those giant onions. Now, if you want the really, really big ones. So here, these are Globo onions, right? I get these from Vessi Seeds. The best way to get big onions is to grow from seeds and not from sets. The reason for that is that a set, oftentimes, because it's dormant, an onion is a biannual plant. So if it goes dormant for the winter, when it revives in the spring, it'll want to flower. So oftentimes, our onion sets tend to put up a scape and try to flower, and that kind of ruins the onion a little bit. It has a solid core, a green core that doesn't cure very well, and so these onions they grow to be around the size of a softball or bigger. And growing from seeds, you can get that, the onion was never put into a dormant stage. So it doesn't have that, is not impelled to flower in its first year. So that's how you get more onions, because you lose fewer of them because they don't tend to bolt. And starting early with seeds at this time of year, they take around 100, 120 days to mature. So if you start this time of year and basically grow them in a big flat, I tend to just sprinkle the seeds, and I'm going to demonstrate that later. After the session, during the question and answer period, I'm going to be planting those onions there. But basically, I just take a big flat, no cells, no little pots or anything like that. Just a big old flat. I sprinkle the seeds just like pepper, thinly spaced, and I just let them grow like that. They kind of grow like lawn. And one of the great things about onions is that their seeds are very, very robust. They're very tough, so you can weed, like, you can test them out. You can separate them very easily. The roots don't tangle so hard, and they're easy to take apart. And you can divide them up when it comes to planting them out in April. As soon as the snow melts and you can work the soil a little bit, get out there, plant your onions, and make sure that they're mulched in with a good layer of compost. Um, Onions need consistent moisture, not wet conditions because they'll rot, but you don't want your onions drying out. You want them growing consistently, constantly, um, and that gives you the best growth of all. If you go through drought periods, for instance, if onions are grown in bare soil, they tend to grow dry, and that really stresses them, and it halts their growth. They kind of stall there. And it might take, if they dry out, it might take a couple of days before they can recover and start growing again. And, if they're dry for, 3, 4 days, and then they're not growing for another 3 or 4 days, even if you water them, sometimes they'll get another drought before they can start growing again. So a good layer of mulch, protect that soil. Some little bit of compost is great. If it's really, really dry, weather, maybe throwing down a little bit of seaweed, um, some dry leaves if you have them. It's a good idea to store some leaves just for that particular reason. You shred them up and you mix them in around your tomato, your onions, just to keep that moisture in there. If it's rainy, obviously you don't need to worry about any of that. Like last summer, we had a very rainy August, and most of my onions rotted out. They didn't get to grow very much. They were too wet, and they didn't produce very well because of that extreme rainy August. It rained almost every day. It was pretty bad for onion. If we're going to plant our onions earlier than some of our other crops, we need to plan ahead a little bit. I would encourage folks to grow in what we call a polyculture. This way, you plant intensively. Like as you see in this slide here, we got some cabbage in the front. This is on the north side of the garden. The garden bed goes from east to west. So the front, or the top side here, you have some leeks. You have a little row of beans, and then you have your cabbage. So I would have planted these leeks here in April. Leeks take a long time to grow. You typically will harvest your leeks in September or October. Sometimes you can leave them into the ground if we don't have a lot of heavy frost in October, November. Sometimes you can get into December before you're able to harvest. You can harvest your leeks. I'll often harvest a few, and I'll leave a few as long as I can, and they just get bigger and bigger. But they're a very small plant. They're not. They don't create a lot of shade. So if you plant your onions in a polyculture on the south end of your row, say if your row is going east-west, on the south side is a great place to put a row of onions, particularly around your cole crops, your cabbage, your kale, your Brussels sprouts, all of these things that have a tendency to attract the cabbage moths, those nasty little white butterflies that lay these nasty little green caterpillars that run damage like crazy. So these onions and other smelly or odoriferous vegetables or even herbs surrounding your kale crops is a great way to camouflage your cabbages from those moths. The moths and other insects, most insects find your crops through the sense of smell. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's a great way to hide them and reduce the impact of pest damage. In my garden, I grow organically and I don't use a lot of pesticides or hardly at all. There's only one or two pesticides that I use. Most of them are homemade, but one for cabbages, I do use BTK. It's a virus that infects the digestive tract of caterpillars. It only infects caterpillars. And so basically, you just give a spray on your cabbages. These moths eat them. They get pretty bad tummy ache, and they curl up and go away. Um, and typically, I only have to put two applications of this per season, and there's no issues at all. You harvest your cabbages and your broccoli and stuff, and they're not infested of all of these little worms that float to the surface when you cook your broccoli, and it kind of looks nasty. Well, you don't have to worry about that so much. It's considered organic because A, it's not a chemical that's going to contaminate anything. B, it has no impact at all on human health. It's been tested. And I'm a little touchy about putting weird things in my garden because I'm going to eat it and I'm going to feed it to my family. So I want to make sure that it's safe. And up to now, like for me, it's been a real benefit to the garden using the BTK. And it's not anything that's giving any negative impacts up to now. Opinions may vary. All opinions, are a personal thing. But from my experience, it's okay to use. Um, but there's a lot of other products on the market that I just simply won't even purchase. I won't bring home at all. Most stuff that you buy in bags and stuff like for the garden, I prefer not to spend money much on my garden. I like to do things natural way as much as possible. And like you see here in this photograph, I've got beans growing next to my cabbages because beans are nitrogen fixing plant. They're a legume. Beans, peas. There's a bunch of other plants of the similar family that have a bacteria growing on the surface of their roots. That it's a symbiotic relationship. This bacteria is able to absorb nitrogen out of the atmosphere, which the plant can't do. 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, but the plants can't access it. They're just not biologically capable of doing it. But this bacteria can do that. So what it does is it accumulates nodules of nitrogen on the root. So if you pull out a bean plant, you'll find these tiny, tiny little potatoes all along the roots. Those are nitrogen packets delivered by these bacteria. In exchange, the plant, beans and peas, give sugar to that bacteria. So they both win. Both of these organisms win. It's a symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis is a very powerful thing, a powerful tool for the garden, because now you can plant your beans next to your cabbage or other greedy plants like corn, for instance. Planting beans all around the roots of your corn is a great way to you fertilize your corn. The beans give a lot of nitrogen to the corn. Corn grows much better that way. And also, I found that when you're harvesting your beans underneath your corn, you're harvesting beans in the shade, and that's a lot more comfortable. I have to say, especially if you have to be out there every 2 days harvesting your beans. When you do that on in the shade, it makes it a much more comfortable experience in your garden. So a polyculture like that, if you're going to if you want to plant some onions and amongst other things in your cabbages, you just determine which garden's going to have your cabbage and where you want to plant your row of onions to surround it. Plant your onions in April, but keep the rest of your garden covered with something opaque, like a tarp, some cardboard, whatever you've got. It can be an old piece of plywood, if you have it, or if you have, like at home, I buy all my garden beds are in standard 36-inch wide, with a 30-inch walkway in between. They're all raised beds. They're 70 feet long and they're 36 inches wide. So I buy tarps, plastic tarps, and are lightweight that I can cover each one of these garden beds, and I can even cover a section of it. I keep rocks along the length of my garden beds, and I use those to hold down those tarps. Or later on in the season, I might cover the whole thing with insect netting or a frost blanket. So having those rocks around, lying around your garden here and there, especially along the length of your garden beds, is a great way to keep on top and of these different materials that you might use to protect your crop. And also, if you have a tendency, like I have a heavy clay soil, so slugs love it at my place. So if you want to get your slugs out of your garden, well, they're going to be hiding underneath your rocks. So you can, just lift up your rocks, bring in a glass with salty water in it, and just pop your slugs in your salty water, and that takes care of the problem. We'll talk about some homemade slug traps later on in more in the for in down the road in the future sessions. But right now, that's just one quick tip. A rock is a very beautiful thing in the garden. So other greens or other plants that like growing around beans are celery. So that's a second crop that we can start at this time of year. I'll typically start my onions and my celery in late February. So today I'm going to be planting one crop of onions, but they take so long to grow. But if you get a head start on them, plant them early, pot them up and get them a good size before you put them out. Celery is sensitive to frost, so you want to wait until your last frost date, and then you can plant them in your garden bed. Now, these two photographs are the same garden, but later on in the season, and you'll see that I have cardboard in the walkway, and I cover that in with some hay. The cardboard prevents weeds from growing through, and the hay just basically keeps things nice and clean and keeps things nice and orderly. And the weed seeds that are in the hay don't germinate through the cardboard, so it's a win-win all around. So you don't want to waste any time weeding your walkways, and if you plant intensively, like I've done here, you hardly get any weeds because there's no sun reaching the ground level. A lot of the issues that we have with weedy gardens is that we keep a lot of our garden beds with bare soil. Every square inch of bare soil wants to grow a weed in it. So if you have a weedy garden, it's because you didn't plant it intensely enough. If uh dandelion can grow there, well, you could have planted an onion there. Or if you have some wood sorrel growing in another place, well, you could have maybe had a lettuce there instead. So think of weeds as telling you where you should put all of these other small plants that can be grown around your other main crops. So here, if you look closely, in this garden bed here, it's a 36-inch wide bed of beans, but in the middle of the garden bed, we've got a row of celery growing amongst hidden underneath the beans. Now, in this photograph here, they're still early in the season, so they're quite small. But the celery is going to grow tall enough that the leaves are going to reach beyond the height of the beans. but the stalk is going to be growing in the shade of the beans. And that gives you, because celery you don't want to have exposed to too much sunlight because the stalks will get darker green and be a little bit more bitter. So they're best grown in this it's best to keep the stalks shaded. Some people will put like a sock, like grow the celery through a sock and just lift the sock up the stalks just so that it stays blanched. Other folks, I have a friend who grows his celery through a milk jug or a milk carton. Basically, he'll cut the tops and the bottom of the milk carton and just slide that over top of his celery. Let the leaves poke out the top so they can photosynthesize. But the stalks stay in the shade. At my place, um, I like to mix and match and see which plants work well together. The nitrogen fixing properties of the beans enhances leaf growth. Nitrogen makes plants grow leaves. And celery is mostly a stalk with leaves. You're not growing your fruit. So matching it with the beans or peas is a great way to really fertilize it and make use of that natural tendency. So these are good companion plants. So typically, like what I have here, it's a 36-inch garden bed. I've got a row of celery in the middle and about 3 rows on each side of 3 rows of beans on each side of the celery. Very, very productive, easy to reach, and easy to harvest. So with celery, by starting early in the season like that, by the time things get going, you don't have to wait until end of September to harvest all your celery at once. By getting a head start like this, getting them reasonably mature, putting them in the garden early like that, you can end up having the potential of harvesting a stalk off of each plant. I'll have like maybe 15 celery plants in that garden bed. And every other day, I can pick 1 or 2 stalks off of each plant and have a big bundle of celery almost every day or every other day. And I could come back and harvest more, and I harvest more. And as the season goes on, more stalks continue to grow. And I'm just, harvesting the bigger ones on the outer edge, leave the little ones in the middle continue to grow. And you have celery until your hard frost kills them all off. So this is a great way to have celery, for the majority all of August, September, October, then it starts to go away. All of my surpluses on this celery, I'll chop them up, put them in the freezer, and they're ready to go anytime I want to make a stew or I want to make a spaghetti sauce or if I need to have some celery for any of my meals, it's sitting there ready to go in the freezer. And I've tried dehydrating them, and I find they don't reconstitute very, very well. You can dehydrate them and grind them up into a powder and use them like a celery powder. But I find that like boiling dried celery, it just stays fibrous and tough and difficult to eat. So I typically will just freeze them up. They freeze well, and they keep a good texture it's not quite the same as it is when it's perfectly fresh, but it's still a good texture, and it's very useful and cheap. A packet of seeds costs like $3 or $4, and but you're going to buy a bundle of celery is going to cost you $7 or $8 for one celery at the store, right? So it's a great way to save a lot of money on something that can be reasonably expensive. So, like I mentioned a while ago, May 24th is our official last frost date. Now, that's official last frost date, but that's not necessarily realistic. Oftentimes, from May 24th to June 10th, you could have a frost in there anytime. So, here I've got and highlighted in yellow here. During that period in time, if I do put anything out, it's going to be covered in a frost blanket immediately. I'll already have onions growing. Onions, I might give them a frost blanket for the first 2 weeks they're growing in April, just to get them established and set up. And once they're established, the roots are growing, the plant starts to grow again. I'll take the frost blanket off because it doesn't need much protection at all. Um, I'll often grow onions, different varieties of onions, some of them like green onions, for instance, shallots. They're basically perennials. They grow through the winter months. The chives will grow through the snow in April. Oftentimes you'll find, little sprigs of onions poking through the snow. They can handle frost. It's not a problem at all. So we don't need to be worried. We can be brave. Bring your onions out there, plant them really, really early. If you're not growing from seeds, still, if you have sets, bring your sets out early, really, really early. Get out there and plant your stuff. I'm giving you permission to plant early. It's okay. The onions will survive and they'll give you a much stronger crop. You want to wait until at least, like, as for myself, if I'm going to grow my cucumbers, for instance, I wait until June 10th to plant my cucumbers outside. I'll cover them in a frost blanket. It'll take a week or so to germinate, and then they're good to go. And I'll keep a frost blanket on them for the first little while. Oftentimes we get cucumber beetles, and they hit young plants. Cucumbers get really hit hard with cucumber beetles when they've grown too long in a pot and then got transplanted. Cucumbers and other related plants don't like to be transplanted very much. They have very sensitive roots. So transplanting a cucumber is very touchy. Um, I'll plant cucumbers in my pots in the house on May 24th. They'll grow for 2 weeks. And once they have their first real leaf, in about 2 weeks, it takes about 2 weeks. They get their first two conical leaves that, basically they're still parts of the seed. And then you have their first real leaf growing. That's when you want to transplant your cucumber, and not later. Oftentimes you'll find some cucumbers in the garden center, and they'll already have flowers and stuff. Don't bring that home. It's not going to produce much. It's going to have a hard time growing, and the cucumber beetles are going to decimate it. A lot of people have problems with cucumber beetles, and that's 80% of the time that's the problem. Pests hit plants that are weak, that are sick, that are ill. They recognize the smell of a plant that's struggling, and they'll hit that one. And because it's too weak to defend itself, most strong plants have the ability to change the taste of their tissues that make themselves unpalatable to the pests. So the pests prefer to go hit a plant that's struggling, that's having a hard time. So by giving your cucumber plants the right length of time, they plant them at the right time on May 24th, let them grow in the house in until the 10th, put them out on the 10th. You can also plant directly into the ground on the 10th. And they'll do fine if you put your frost blanket over top of them. Keep the frost blanket on top of them until the plant A is well established. It's already starting to flower a little bit. Once the flowers are out, the first few flowers, it's okay if you don't let them pollinate. If you keep them covered with a frost blanket, the cucumber beetles aren't getting to them. And then after a while, they get really, really strong, and they have more vigorous growth, and the weather's really nice by then. Take that frost blanket off and let the plants, receive your bees and your pollinators, and they'll be much stronger, and they'll be much less vulnerable to pest damage. And that's cucumber beetles, aphids, all pretty much most pests tend to be attracted to plants that are sick. That's how nature takes care of illness. The pests come in, predators come in, and weed them out. So if we plant in order to enhance our plant's innate strength and let it, acquire as much nutrient out of the ground as it can, then you'll have a much stronger cucumber plant. And cucumber beetles will be present, but they won't be tearing your plant down, you know. So usually at my place here, these are practices that I do. I don't tend to have very much issues with that. I've got a question here in the chats by Carla looking for information on what a frost blanket is. Um, a frost blanket is basically like a thin, kind of like, it's like a cheap fabric. It's really, really thin white fabric. But you can set that, it's very lightweight. You can set that on top of your row of crops on your plants, And what happens with frost? Frost moves over the landscape just like molasses. It's like a thin layer. It might be 3 inches, it might be 6 inches, it might be a foot or two deep, but it's like a cold air mass that flows over the landscape like molasses, and it pools in the low areas. But if you have a frost blanket over top of your plant, that cold air flows over top of your frost blanket, but doesn't seep in. So you got like a little bubble of protected air around your delicate little plant. And and that cold air comes down from above and settles on the ground and flows like that.